Chapter 4 The Windowless Cabin. The Hardys and Chet stood frozen for a moment, as if entranced by the fierce stare of the wild face above them. And then suddenly the person back of the boulder was gone. "The witch," breathed Chet, who had turned chalk white. "It must have gotten Captain Maguire." "Witch or no witch, it can't have gone far," Joe cried out, leaping to his feet. "Come on!" Frank sprinted forward with his brother along on the dark forest path. The two boys ran through the dark woods, turning and twisting the unfamiliar trail, dodging trees and hurdling small bushes. From ahead came the sound of somebody crackling through the underbrush. Suddenly, Frank caught a glimpse of a tall, rangy figure in dark flannel trousers and a green sweater, darting swiftly in and out of the huge trees. "That's no witch," Frank panted, "but he sure can run." In fact, the long-legged stranger seemed to be pulling away from the Hardys, though they were both strong runners. Unexpectedly, he cut sharply to his left, leaving the path and darting in a straight line across the forest floor. With amazing agility, he leapt over fallen trees and ducked under low-hanging branches. "Keep him in sight," Joe yelled. "We'll trap him against the hillside." But the strange figure, upon reaching the steep wooded side of the hollow, did not pause. Grasping at small trees and bushes with his long arms, he clambered swiftly up the hillside from one foothold to another. Apparently he knew the route well. Frank and Joe, meanwhile, were forced to waste precious time battling their way up. Doggedly they kept on, but the gap between the pursuers and their quarry widened. At last, halfway up the valley wall, the man broke into the open in the gray sunlit rock, forming the upper rim of the hollow. Skillfully he moved diagonally from rock to rock until he disappeared from sight beyond the rim. Frank and Joe, who had just emerged from the trees, sat down on a rock to catch their breath. "There's one witch that doesn't need a broomstick," observed Joe, shaking his head ruefully. Frank had removed his binoculars from the leather case in front of him. He trained them on the rim of the valley where the strange figure had vanished. Meanwhile, Chet had reached the side of the hollow. After a toiling climb, the panting boy hove into view. "Whew, I thought I was never going to catch up with you fellows. But old Chet wasn't going to stay down in those woods by himself." "Say," he asked, looking around at the rocks apprehensively, Where's the guy with the face?" "Escaped," Joe replied. Frank, unable to spot the figure with his binoculars, moved up higher on the rock. He began to examine the entire perimeter of the little valley systematically. By means of the glasses, every fissure, every possible hiding place in the rock could be studied. Nothing suspicious appeared beneath Frank's scrutiny. Finally, he turned the glasses upon the floor of the black hollow. "See anything?" Joe asked. "Lots of trees, that's all." As Frank continued to sweep the binoculars through a slow arc toward the end of the hollow, he was surprised to see a small clearing. "Hold on! Here's something," he called down. Joe and Chet started upward. "Well, what do you know about that?" declared Frank in his astonished voice. As Chet and Joe clambered up beside him, silently he handed the glasses to his brother and pointed the direction with his finger. At first, Joe saw only a little clearing at the edge of the trees. "Look at the base of that rock wall," Frank said, "and look very closely at the pile of tree trunks and rocks you see there." Wondering, Joe did so. Suddenly, it occurred to him that the rocks and logs had been put together in a careful, regular manner. "Why," he burst out, "that's not a pile at all. It's a little building. There aren't any windows, but I'd say it's a very cleverly camouflaged cabin." "You're right, fellows," Chet agreed when it came his turn to look. "Who'd want to live in a place like that anyway?" "Say, Do you suppose it's that queer guy with the creepy face?" "Could be," Joe answered. "Anyway, whoever lives there may be able to tell us where Captain Maguire is. Let's go and find out, right now." "Aw, way down there at the end of the hollow? Have a heart, fellas. What about lunch?" But Chet's protest fell on deaf ears. As the hungry boy knew from past experience, when the hardy boys were following up a promising clue, ordinary things like lunches did not count. Leaving the bright sunshine of the exposed rocks, the trio descended once more into the gloomy hollow. Frank and Joe quickly reached the forest floor. As they waited for Chet, they heard a crashing sound above and a familiar voice booming, "Help! Gangway!" As they jumped to one side, Chet came sliding down the steep hillside. He tumbled into a heap on the moss below. "Jumping toads!" Joe exclaimed. "I thought the whole rock face was caving in on us." "Can I help it if I'm not made for these pesky mountains?" demanded Chet in an injured tone. While Joe helped Chet up, Frank scouted ahead to find the path once more. In a few minutes he located it. "It isn't much of a trail anymore," Frank reported, "but it's going in the direction that we want." Half an hour's walk brought them to the edge of that little clearing where Frank, raising his hand, signaled a halt. Even from there, the mysterious little house was difficult to see, although it was not more than a dozen yards away. Warily the boys scrutinized the clearing, as well as the odd house, built of rocks and logs. It had a dark brown door. Seeing no one, the boys stepped into the open and crossed the intervening space and knocked boldly on the wooden door. "Nobody's home," muttered Joe, as Frank knocked again and again. "I'm sure I heard something, though." Chet, meanwhile, had poked his head around one corner of the log cabin. "Wonder what's fenced in over there." He walked to the high palings of a strange three-sided enclosure. "What do you see?" called Joe, as the stout boy peered through the fence. "Bah! There's your answer. Sheep," Chet grinned. "Guess I scared 'em." "Well, nobody's inside the house, that's certain," Frank concluded. "Let's take a look at the rest of the outside." Accordingly, the three proceeded around the other side of the mysterious structure. Abruptly, they found themselves face to face with the rock wall of the hollow. The strange little house had no fourth man-made side. "Do you suppose whoever built this house was just lazy?" Joe wondered, "and used the rock for a wall? Or could there be some other reason?" "His house certainly blends in with the rock," Frank reminded him. "You couldn't just distinguish it from a distance without field glasses." "Might as well head back," said Joe. "There isn't anything doing here. Personally, I'd like to find out who owns this house. In fact, it would be interesting to know who owns Black Hollow." "Let's not forget Captain Maguire," Frank reminded them gravely. "This house, and the person who is spying on us, may or may not have something to do with his disappearance. Of one thing we are sure, something happened to the captain here in this hollow. And the sooner we get back to town and report it to the sheriff, the better." An hour's vigorous hiking brought them back to Captain Maguire's cabin on the opposite rim of the hollow. While Chet grabbed a box of crackers and 3 apples, Frank penciled a brief note. "For Captain Maguire in case he comes back," Frank put at the top. Joe and Chet said nothing, and the 3 boys climbed into the yellow convertible and headed for the sheriff's office at Forestburg. All 3 were convinced that the captain had met with trouble. End of chapter 4.